May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, Adonai, our rock and our redeemer. Okay, folks, what is wrong with this picture? Anybody know?
Shimshon he's shackled.
Well, he's not shackled. He's in the temple. Yeah, he is shackled. He's in the Philistine temple. He's bringing the Philistine temple down on everyone's heads.
Yeah.
That's not what I was thinking of.
Mm.
What I was thinking of is the name on this is a comic cover. The name Samson, strong and faithful. That's half true.
He wasn't faithful, right?
That's true. That's true. So we're going to be looking. Let's see how I get this to work here. There we are. Samson, a study in missed destiny, misdirection, and misspent life. We're going to be looking at Samson's life as a whole. Today we just read about the prophecy of his birth and the nature of his life, that he would be supposed to be a Nazir, especially dedicated to God, not to drink any wine, not to let a razor touch his head. Even his mother was supposed to take certain Nazirite restrictions. And during her pregnancy, she was not to drink anything from the grape and not touch anything unclean. So we learn that. We learn later in the story that God gifts Samson with unique strength. And let's go on and learn what we can from Samson's life, a study in missed destiny, misdirection, and a misspent life. So here's a little background. There's Samson's mother, by the way, down there with the staff in her hand, and there's the angel. Little background. He was born at a time of need. For 20 years, the Philistines were dominating the Israelites and keeping them without their freedom, keeping them subjugated. So he was born at a time of need. His parents are old and somewhat spent. It's interesting how many, there are 8 miraculous births that I have counted in Scripture. And in my educational newsletter called The Applied Parsha, I numbered them. John the Baptist's parents were old and spent. And Abraham and Sarah were 190 respectively, when Isaac was born. It seems to me that Samson's parents are overwhelmed a little. As they deal with him, he's a very strong-willed child. And he, as we'll see, he's somewhat narcissistic and spoiled. It's very understandable why he was spoiled. He's a child of their old age. He's the answer to their dream. He's a child who was born as a consequence of an angelic visitation. I mean, this is a special kid, and he's spoiled by his parents, and he kind of overwhelms them in the story. We'll see signs of that. But he's a child of miraculous destiny through unforgettable means. We continue. So what? We should learn from Samson's story about the influence of entry context on the meaning of someone's life. What were the conditions into which he was born? What were the conditions into which you were born? What were the conditions into which I was born? This is an important factor in terms of what our service to God might turn out to be and what it should be. His entry context, as I said, was during a time when the Philistines were dominating the people of Israel. His family base is important, just as yours and mine would be. He's born to two elderly parents who had certainly, I would say, given up on having a child. And he's born with a certain revelation of his destiny. His parents, no doubt, there can be absolutely no doubt that they told him countless times about the angel. And he probably, as a little boy, said, "Tell me again, Mommy. Tell me again about the angel." He heard that. He had a revelation of his destiny. And we should learn from him, because we don't want our lives to be studies in unfulfilled promise like his was. It's a very tragic life. Maybe it's because I'm getting to be an old guy, I'm getting sentimental, but it moves me deeply. It's such a tragedy. Tragedy should move us. And Samson's life is a tragedy, and we want to learn from it. So, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got to get you here. So what's the story? First of all, as I said, and there's his parents on the right there. The artist is right in making them gray-haired and rather older. He's spoiled and he's narcissistic. In the story of Samson, which I encourage you to read, it's only a few chapters. He's very caught up in his own appetites. He's easily insulted. A number of times when he feels he's been insulted, he takes revenge. He's a real narcissist. But he's spoiled. And I don't condemn his parents for it. It would be a natural tendency to spoil him. His parents are somewhat overwhelmed. They try to resist him. Early in the story, there's a woman who's not a Jew that he wants to marry. This is long before Delilah. There are three women he gets involved with in his story. There's the first woman, who's a Philistine. Then he gets involved with a prostitute. And later he gets on with Delilah. And each one of those situations is a disaster, a complete disaster. And his parents, in the first case, we see they're trying to tell him, "Look, why can't you marry a girl from among our people?" But he says, "No, I don't want that. Go get her from me." That's what he says. "Get this girl from me." He's such a narcissist, and the family is so topsy-turvy. His parents are overwhelmed, and the text presents him repeatedly with his parents, as if he's only a child. In a number of the narrations, he appears with his parents. He's an adult man, and he appears with his parents in situations where he wants them to cooperate with fulfilling his needs. It's a picture of an immature person. He's immature. He's narcissistic. He's driven by his appetites for food. That's why after he kills this lion, he comes by later on, and the lion is now a rotting corpse in the midst of the forest or wherever it was, and bees have built a nest in there. He grabs honey out of that, touching this corpse, which is a violation of his vows. He implicates his parents by giving them some of the honey. He's ruled by his appetites for food and for women. And he's quickly angered with violent results. Now, God uses him even in that condition. He uses his anger because the anger is against Philistines. And he goes out and he really exacts a price from them. And we're told that he is strengthened by God, and he's smiting Israel's enemies. Sometimes, often, as a matter of fact, in my view, always, God uses people who are flawed. He uses me. You don't know how flawed I am. I'm very flawed. A lot of contradictions in my life over the years. But yet God will use people who are flawed like that. He really uses them, but also they're really flawed. God uses Samson. The Bible says that God uses even the wrath of men to praise him. The wrath of men is not a good thing, but God even uses that for his praise. And here we see Samson, spoiled and narcissistic, overwhelmed parents, a man-child. He's immature, driven by his appetites for food and for women, and he quickly gets angry and he works it out in violence. He's like a young man in our culture. There are many young men like this, still living with their parents, sleeping around, getting into trouble because of their appetites and their anger. There are a lot of young toughs like this, a lot of young, spoiled men who get involved in legal trouble, get involved in violence. They're living with mom and dad. They're sleeping around. They've got often they have children that are born out of wedlock, and they're not really accompanying the woman. They just move on. This is a very contemporary story. So Samson gets in trouble, and he causes trouble. Here on the left-hand side, you see a picture of him after one of the insults that he experiences. He goes out and he slays 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. He's touching the bone of a dead animal, not good for a Nazarite, but he uses that to wreak vengeance on these Philistines. In another situation, he wreaks vengeance by capturing 300 foxes, which is quite impressive. And he ties the foxes' tails together with a torch involved, and the foxes run in the Philistine grain fields. And of course, they cause a fire in a huge grain fields of the Philistines, destroying their crops. So he gets into trouble, and then he causes trouble as a result. We see this. We see it again. There's Delilah on the left, and there's Samson's head in her lap, and Samson happens to look like Victor Mature in this picture. I saw that movie of Samson and Delilah when I was a little kid. I don't know if that's Darth Lamour or who it is, but there's Samson asleep with his head on the lap of his loved one, and she's about to betray him. And after he can't resist her. He resists her 2 or 3 times when she wants to know what the secret of his strength is. Finally, she continues to cajole him, and foolishly, stupidly, but as a sign of his weakness, she caters to his ego. She whines and pleads with him, and then he tells her the secret of his strength. And on the right there, you see where he ends up. He ends up actually, he's blinded by the Philistines. They have him working a mill where he's pushing a wheel that grinds wheat. He's a slave chained to a wheel, blind. And that's where he ends up. So, moving on. Again, so what? I want you to think about yourself for a minute now. Let me think about myself. I've been thinking about my parents just about every day. I don't know when this started, but I think it's due to my age. And I've been thinking about my family of origin, the good things and the bad things, what I should have learned, what I did learn, what I did not receive. It's a very personal thing, but I encourage you all to think about your own entry context. Yes, that's the family base, rather. That's the second bullet point, the family base. Think about your family base. What kind of a family were you born into? What were the conditions you experienced? What were the relationships you experienced? What were the people who are worthy of imitation that were in your family? What were the people who are not worthy of imitation? You can learn a lot from people who are not worthy of imitation. I've mentioned a friend of mine, Michael Rudelnik, who's the professor of Bible, of Jewish studies at Moody Bible Institute. He's a great scholar, a great guy, and he's the best father I know. I visited his home once, and I had a chance to observe his relationship and that of his wife with their 2 sons, and he was exemplary. And then Michael told me that his own father, who was a Holocaust survivor, was abusive. And I said, wait a minute, Michael, this doesn't make sense to me. You're the best father I know, and you're telling me you had an abusive father? I said, how is this possible? He said, it's easy. He said, whenever my father did anything to me that he shouldn't have done, I made a note in my mind, when I'm a father, I won't do that. So I've known more than one person who has learned from bad examples of their family base. You can learn from that. Learn from the good stuff. I often talk to you about my Aunt Angela, who was one of the most godly people. She was not outwardly religious, but in terms of her relational life, she was a giant. I learned from her. You look at yourself. What do you learn from your family base? What do you learn from your entry context? That is the historical, the environmental, the economic situation you were born into. What do you learn from that? What do you learn about the times in which we live in terms of how that should influence how you serve God? You need to ask those questions. Those questions show up with Samson. Samson had a destiny revelation. He knew, he found out from even before he was born that he was born for something special. John the Baptist, the same way. There are various ways in which we get an intimation of our destiny. Sometimes it's a prophetic word that's spoken to us. Sometimes someone will say something to you, they have no idea how significant it is. A related story, Denzel Washington came from a Christian family. I think his family was Seventh-day Adventists, I'm not sure. But he's a very, very godly man. But he wasn't a godly teenager. He was not doing well. His mother operated a beauty shop. And one time he was in the beauty shop, he was a teenager, and a woman there is looking at him, staring at him. She says, come here, son. And she tells him words something like this: son, you're going to be a very famous man. You're going to be able to go all around the world and influence people all over the world. And you need to honor God. That was a prophetic word. She didn't lapse into King James English. She just had an insight that was God-given, that was absolutely true. And that can happen with us sometimes. Even people who don't realize what they're saying, they don't realize the weight of it. God will use them. So that's another way. Dreams, prophetic words, and also deep intuitions, where you know because you know because you know. So I ask you, what promise lies unfulfilled in you? What promise lies unfulfilled in me? At my age, just this week, I've been thinking with some sadness about the things I've accomplished, the things that I have not accomplished, the things I wanted to accomplish that have not gotten done. That's the way you think when you're in your 70s. But it's a good way to think. What promise lies unfulfilled in you? What is it about you as you are, as God has made you? Your spiritual gifts, your natural abilities, your acquired skills, your experience, what your holy hunches about what you should have been up to. What promise lies unfulfilled in you? And what should you do now about that? Sometimes you can't do much about it. One time I was quite certain, and my wife knows this, I was quite certain that God had called us to make Aliyah. This is going back over 40 years ago. I was visiting in Israel, and I felt a strong feeling that God wanted us to do that. And so I came back from Israel. I stayed awake all night before the day before we left Israel. I wrote a letter to my boss, who was a very overwhelming person. And I wanted to share that with him. But when I tried to do so, he turned around and said, "You're aggressing me." He intimidated me. He was 430 pounds and 6'1", easy to be intimidated by a man like that. And I just stuffed it. I never shared that with him. And the opportunity passed. So there are some missed opportunities in your life where the door opened and you could have walked through it, but you didn't. Don't beat yourself up. That door may close, but there are other doors. So, what promise lies unfulfilled in you, if anything? Don't waste your time feeling guilty, stupid, beating yourself up. That doesn't glorify God at all. But what streams of purpose should you regather in your hands at this time in your life and move forward, if any? And what new doors are opening to you that you should take? That's a good question. Poor Samson, a study in unfulfilled potential. So I've talked to you about different types of destiny revelation. I've talked to you about timing factors. The doors open and doors close, but new doors may open later. There are lessons to be learned from your past, from the bad stuff and the good stuff. All of it is valuable. Finally, what should you be doing? What should I be doing to help children and grandchildren? I now know something about grandchildren and other family members and friends to discover and honor their identity and potential. What should we be doing to help younger people move forward into their particular, the will of God for them particularly? We could talk a lot about that, but not now. So I'd like, Patricia Levy Andrews loves to read, and I love to give her an opportunity to do so. This is of just a few lines from a poem by the great genius, John Milton, who was blind, but what a poet. And this is from a masterful long poem he's written called Samson Agonistes. I think it means the sufferings of Samson. Samson Agonistes, 17th century. And I'd like you, Patricia, to read these lines. All of you pay attention to this because Milton was phenomenal in his insight and his use of language. Please, Patricia.
Thank you. Why was my breeding ordered and prescribed as of a person separate to God, designed for great exploits? If I must die, betrayed, captivated, and both my eyes put out, made of my enemies the scorn and gaze, to grind in brazen fetters under task, with this heaven-gifted strength, O glorious strength, put to the labor of a beast, debased, lower than a bond slave. Promise was that I should Israel from Philistine yoke deliver. As for this great deliverer now, and find him, eyeless in Gaza, at the mill with slaves, himself in bonds under Philistine yoke.
Oh, what words. Ask for this great deliverer now and find him eyeless in Gaza at the mill with slaves, himself in bonds under Philistine yoke. Oh. I thank John Milton and the God who created his soul for these lines which end our consideration today. I expect, of course, for all of you, better things than what visited Samson. His misdirected life, his misspent life, his unfulfilled promise. I know that we're not in as much trouble as he, but there are lessons to learn from his mistakes. I hope I've made that clear now. So I want to see your faces, and